All right, ready to dive deep. Today, it's all about the Philippine Constitution. You sent over some excerpts from a textbook on the subject, so we're going to break it all down.
Yeah, cut through the legal jargon and get to the good stuff.
You know me, I love those little-known historical facts, the ones that make you go, wait, really? I'm betting there are a bunch of those in this deep dive.
Oh, absolutely. The best way to understand the Philippine Constitution is to go back in time, to before it even existed.
I'm always up for a little time travel, so where are we headed first on this journey?
Well, way before they had a written constitution, the Philippines wasn't even a unified nation. It was a bunch of independent settlements called barangays.
Barangays, I've heard that word. What were they exactly?
Imagine like mini-states, each one with maybe 100 families. They were independent and self-governing.
Self-governing mini-states across the islands. Wow, that's not how I picture the Philippines today. Almost like ancient Greece with all their city-states.
You're not wrong. And here's a fun fact. The word barangay actually comes from the Malayan word for boat.
Hold on, a community named after a boat? Gotta be a story there, right?
There is. It tells us that the early Filipinos were closely connected to the sea. Historians think they traveled by boat and eventually settled in different parts of the islands.
That explains the independent barangays. Okay, so how did they go from these independent communities to a unified country with a constitution?
Buckle up. It's a long story with lots of twists and turns. Spanish rule, American colonization, Japanese occupation, and then finally independence.
So all these different periods shaped how the Philippines was governed and eventually led to their constitution.
Exactly. Along the way, they had different constitutions too, each one reflecting those changes in power and influence.
Wow, so it wasn't just one constitution, but a whole series of them.
Exactly. For instance, there was the Malolos Constitution during the short-lived First Philippine Republic, a very progressive constitution for its time.
Progressive, how so?
Well, for starters, it set up a parliamentary system.
Instead of a president, they had a prime minister.
Right. It was a really bold move towards democracy. Didn't last too long, though.
So first the Malolos Constitution, then what?
Well, then you have the Japanese-sponsored one during World War II. And then came the 1935 Constitution, which lasted through the Commonwealth period and the Third Republic.
That's a lot of constitutional changes.
Each one reflecting the politics of the time. But through it all, the spirit of the Filipino nation stayed strong.
It is pretty impressive. Even with all those changes in government, the idea of the Philippines as a nation stuck around.
It shows how resilient the Filipinos are and their desire for self-determination. And that brings us to the 1973 Constitution, which came about during a very intense time.
That was the Marcos era, right? I know that was the controversial time.
Very much so. And that's reflected in the 73 Constitution. It shifted things, gave more power to the president.
So it moved away from the legislature and towards the executive branch?
You could say that. Even today, people debate about the 73 Constitution. Historians analyze it closely.
Sounds like a turning point in how the Philippines was governed. But eventually they got to the constitution they have today, right? The 1987 Constitution.
The 1987 Constitution is like the combination of all those historical experiences. It shows their journey, their struggles for democracy, their hopes for a fair society.
So it's more than just a bunch of laws. It represents who they are and what they want for the future.
Exactly. And what makes it so interesting is how it balances those hopes with the realities of governing a country as diverse and complex as the Philippines.
I'm starting to see why you find this so fascinating. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are some of the core principles of the 1987 Constitution? What makes it tick?
Well, first off, it establishes the Philippines as a republic with a written constitution.
Now, I might sound silly here, but what does it even mean to have a written constitution? Isn't that how they all are?
Not necessarily. Not every country has its most important laws laid out in a single document. The United Kingdom, for example, they've got what's called an unwritten constitution. It's built on centuries of traditions, legal decisions, acts of parliament.
So their constitution is like spread out over their whole history and legal system?
Exactly. But the Philippines chose to put it all in one document. That gives them a clear plan for how the government works and what rights citizens have.
So it's like the ultimate rule book for the whole country.
You got it. It keeps things stable, makes things transparent. Everybody knows what the rules are.
Makes sense. So a written constitution, that's key. What else is at the heart of this 1987 Constitution?
Right from the start, it emphasizes two crucial things: civilian supremacy over the military and separation of church and state.
Civilian supremacy. Okay, so no more military dictatorships, right?
Exactly. The military answers to civilian leaders. It's all right there in the Constitution. Super important to prevent coups and make sure that people hold the power.
Given the Philippines' history, that's huge. What about the separation of church and state? That's all about religious freedom, right?
Yes, it guarantees everyone the right to practice their own religion without the government interfering. It also keeps any one religion from influencing government policies.
So it protects individual beliefs and makes sure no religious group can control the government.
Right. It's about creating a society where people of all faiths, or no faith, can live together peacefully and participate equally.
It sounds like those principles are the foundation of a healthy democracy.
They are. Think about it. Civilian control over the military stops power from being concentrated in just a few hands. And separating church and state protects freedom and prevents religious discrimination.
I'm starting to see how these principles play out in everyday life, how they actually shape the Filipino experience.
They really do. That's what's so fascinating about constitutions. They're not just words on paper. They actually impact people's lives and shape how societies work.
So we've got these foundational principles, but the Philippines is a bunch of islands, right? How does the Constitution define their territory?
Great question. The Constitution is very clear about what belongs to the Philippines: the internal waters, the territorial sea, the islands, and the airspace. But there's a twist.
Ooh, I love a good twist. Tell me more.
The 1973 Constitution actually broadened the language around territorial claims, potentially to include places like Sabah, that's formerly North Borneo, and even the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea.
Seriously, those are pretty big deals, and contested too.
Absolutely. It brings up a whole bunch of questions about the history and the politics behind those claims. Maybe a deep dive for another day.
You know, I'm always down for a history deep dive. But let's stick with the '87 Constitution for now. We talked about how it structures the government and some of its big ideas. What about individual rights and freedoms? What to say about those?
Well, that's where the Bill of Rights comes in. It's a cornerstone of the 1987 Constitution, and it guarantees basic freedoms and protections for every Filipino citizen.
So it's kind of like their version of the American Bill of Rights.
You could say that. Similar idea, but with specific provisions that fit the Philippines.
Okay, give me the rundown. What kind of rights are we talking about?
Imagine this. You're at home, minding your own business. The government can't just barge in without a warrant. They need a good reason. That's the right against unreasonable searches and seizures.
So it's about protecting your privacy and keeping the government in check.
Exactly. Now imagine you're in Manila, protesting peacefully about something you care about. What protects your right to do that?
That would be freedom of speech and assembly, right?
Yeah, got it. Those rights are absolutely essential in a democracy. They let citizens speak their minds and be part of the conversation without fear.
So even if a protest gets a bit heated, it's still protected.
Well, the Constitution talks about peaceful assembly. So there are limits. Freedom of speech and assembly are fundamental, but they can be limited if public safety is at risk.
Right, gotta have some boundaries.
Of course. And just like in the U.S., the Philippine Bill of Rights includes freedom of religion. Everyone gets to choose their beliefs and practice them freely.
Okay, so I could build a massive shrine to my favorite podcast in my backyard. No problem.
Well, that's where it gets a little tricky. You can believe what you want, but acting on those beliefs can be limited, especially if those actions hurt other people or disrupt the peace. So that giant shrine might be a no-go if it violates zoning laws or puts people at risk.
Right. So believe what you want, but you can't always do whatever you want, especially if it affects others or breaks the law.
Precisely. It's about balancing individual freedom with the needs of the whole society.
Okay, got it. So no unreasonable searches, freedom of speech and assembly, freedom of religion. What other cool rights are in the Philippine Bill of Rights?
It also protects your privacy of communication. Think phone calls, letters, emails. The government can't just snoop on those without a good reason.
So no wiretapping unless they have a warrant.
Nope. And if they do get evidence that way, it can't be used in court. It's a really important safeguard against the government getting too nosy and protects those private conversations.
Strong protection. It really emphasizes the importance of doing things by the book. Speaking of which, what about being treated fairly in legal proceedings? Are there any rights that guarantee that?
Absolutely. The right to due process and equal protection, those are huge. They make sure everyone is treated fairly and equally under the law. Doesn't matter who you are or what your background is.
So everyone has the right to a fair trial and equal treatment under the law. What about self-incrimination? Anything like the American right to remain silent?
Yes, absolutely. The Philippine Constitution protects against self-incrimination too. You can't be forced to testify against yourself, and they can't torture you or force a confession. It's all about upholding human dignity.
That's good to know. All these rights are about protecting people from the government having too much power. So how about the government itself? How does the Constitution structure the Philippine government?
Well, it sets up a presidential system with three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial.
Ah, the classic separation of powers. Tell me more about each one.
All right, so the legislative branch makes the laws, they handle the budget, and oversee the government. That's the Senate and the House of Representatives.
They're the rule makers and they control the money. Okay, what about the executive branch?
That's the president's domain. The president puts those laws into action, appoints officials, represents the country to the world.
Sounds like a big job.
It is. And then there's the judicial branch. At the top, you have the Supreme Court. They interpret the laws, settle legal battles, make sure justice is served. Basically, they're the guardians of the Constitution and the rule of law.
Okay, so three branches, each with its own powers. How does the Constitution make sure no one branch gets too powerful?
That's where the checks and balances come in. Each branch has ways to limit the power of the other two. It's like a delicate dance to keep everything balanced.
They keep each other in line. I like it.
Exactly. The people who wrote the Constitution knew they had to prevent any one branch from taking over. It's a key part of protecting freedoms.
This deep dive is really giving us a look behind the curtain at how the Philippine government works. Are there other aspects of Filipino society that the 1987 Constitution touches on?
Absolutely. It goes beyond the government structure. It dives into social justice, human rights, education. It's about setting the stage for a more fair and prosperous society for everyone.
Okay, I like where this is going. So it's not just about laws and government, it's about building a just and fair society.
Right. The idea of social justice is woven right into the Constitution. It's a call for the government to create opportunities, to make sure wealth is shared more fairly, and to lift up those who have been marginalized.
That's a big task. How does the Constitution approach that in practical terms?
Well, one way is by pushing for reforms in land ownership and natural resources. There are mandates for agrarian reform, acknowledging that historically land ownership hasn't been fair. It's about making things more equitable.
So making sure farmers and people who rely on natural resources have a fair shot.
Exactly. And it protects labor rights, too. The right to form unions, bargain collectively, get a fair share of what's produced. It's all about fairness.
So looking out for farmers, workers, anyone who's been at a disadvantage? Makes sense. What about education?
Education is huge. The Constitution sees it as vital for both individuals and the nation as a whole. It guarantees the right to quality education at all levels. It's about empowering people and building a stronger Philippines through education.
Education is definitely key. This Constitution really seems to emphasize fairness, human rights, and taking care of its people.
It does, and it goes beyond general principles, too. It addresses specific things that have been important in Philippine history and society.
Such as? Give me an example.
Well, take the idea of national patrimony and the economy. The Constitution stresses that the Philippines' natural resources should be protected, developed, and used to benefit the Filipino people.
National patrimony sounds pretty important. What exactly does it mean?
Basically, it's all the things that make up the nation's inheritance. Its natural resources, cultural treasures, and so on. The Constitution says it's super important to safeguard all of that from exploitation and make sure Filipinos benefit from their own country's wealth.
So things like protecting the rainforests, preserving historical sites, and making sure Filipinos have control over their resources.
Exactly. There are even parts of the Constitution that limit how much foreign companies can exploit those resources. It's about prioritizing Filipino ownership and control.
I'm noticing a theme here. Putting Filipinos first.
You're right. The Constitution is rooted in nationalistic ideas, especially when it comes to the economy.
How so? What else does it say about the economy?
It encourages things like using Filipino labor, domestic materials, and locally made products. It's about boosting their own industries.
So building a self-reliant and sustainable economy.
Precisely. But it doesn't mean cutting themselves off from the world. It recognizes they need international trade and cooperation, but it has to be fair and beneficial to the Philippines.
Finding that balance between protecting their interests and working with other countries.
Exactly. And on that note, the Constitution also talks about foreign loans.
Ah, yes, foreign loans. I've heard stories about countries getting stuck in debt because of borrowing irresponsibly. What does the Philippine Constitution say about that?
It's very clear. Foreign loans have to follow the law and be regulated by the monetary authority.
So no shady deals or borrowing more than
Yeah.
they can handle.
Exactly. It's there to prevent reckless borrowing and make sure everything's transparent. The goal is to protect the Philippines' financial future and make sure future generations aren't stuck with huge debts.
Makes sense. Nobody wants to see the Philippines in a debt crisis. Okay, so we've covered the economy, natural resources, even foreign loans. What else does this Constitution address?
There's a lot more. For instance, it sets up various independent commissions to help keep the government accountable and functioning well. These commissions have a really important job, upholding the Constitution and protecting the rights of the people.
Okay, tell me more about these commissions. What kind of commissions are we talking about?
Well, we already talked about the Commission on Human Rights, but there's also the Commission on Elections, which makes sure elections are free and fair. Super important in a democracy.
Free and fair elections can't have a democracy without them.
Exactly. Then there's the Commission on Audit. They're like watchdogs, scrutinizing government spending, making sure the money's being used properly.
Making sure nobody's getting their hands in the treasury.
You could say that. They're vital for preventing corruption and making the government transparent.
What other commissions are there?
Well, you've got the Civil Service Commission. They're all about making sure the government bureaucracy is run based on merit, that people are qualified for their jobs.
No more giving government jobs to friends and family just because you know them.
That's the idea. It's about making sure the government is efficient and effective. Positions should be filled based on skills and qualifications.
That's crucial. So these commissions are there to ensure the government is truly serving the people.
Absolutely. They're like built-in checks and balances to make sure power is used responsibly and people's rights are protected. And then there's also the ombudsman.
The ombudsman.
Yeah, they investigate complaints against government officials. If someone thinks an official has done something wrong, they go to the ombudsman.
So they're like an independent investigator making sure government officials are held accountable?
Exactly. They're a watchdog, making sure justice is served. It seems like the people who created this Constitution thought of everything. It's comprehensive, covering so many aspects of Philippine society. It really is. They wanted a system that would protect individual rights, promote social justice, and make sure their democracy was stable and working. And one more really important area they addressed is local governance.
Ah, yes. We talked about the national government, but what about at the local level? Provinces, cities, those barangays we talked about before.
Well, the 1987 Constitution emphasizes local autonomy. Local government units have a good amount of power and responsibility.
So it's not like everything is controlled from Manila.
Not at all. The Constitution recognizes that local communities often know best how to deal with their own unique challenges.
That makes sense. So it's about empowering local governments to make decisions that directly affect their people.
Exactly. It's about bringing governance closer to the people and making it more responsive to their needs.
I like it. It gives people more of a say in how their communities are run. How does that work in practice?
Well, local officials, like governors, mayors, and councilors, are elected by the people they represent.
By the people, for the people.
Exactly. And they have real power. They can raise revenue, manage their own budgets, and create programs that fit the specific needs of their communities.
Real power and financial independence. That's great.
It allows them to respond to the people they serve more effectively. And they can try new and innovative solutions to local problems.
Sounds like a recipe for better and more accountable governance overall.
That's the goal. A strong democracy needs people to be involved at all levels, national and local. The 1987 Constitution recognizes this and tries to empower local communities.
Okay, so the Constitution covers the big picture stuff and the everyday details of how things work. But can it be changed? Can the Philippine Constitution be amended?
Oh, absolutely. The people who wrote it understood that things change, societies evolve, and the Constitution has to adapt.
I bet amending it isn't a simple process.
You're right, it's not. It has to be done carefully, with a lot of thought. They put in safeguards to prevent reckless or rushed changes.
Makes sense. It's the fundamental law of the land. So walk me through it. How can the Philippine Constitution be amended?
There are three main ways. Through Congress, a constitutional convention, or directly by the people, which is called an initiative.
Wait, the people can directly propose changes. That's pretty cool.
It is. It shows the power of the people in a democracy. But going back to Congress, they can propose amendments, but it takes a 3/4 vote of all members. That's a high bar to clear.
It's meant to make sure any changes have a lot of support.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, a constitutional convention is a special group that gets together just to propose changes. Congress can call for one with a 2/3 vote, or they can ask the people to vote on whether to have a convention. That's called a referendum.
So even when it comes to changing the Constitution, there are checks and balances in place.
Always. And if the people want to propose changes directly, that's the people's initiative. They need to get a petition signed by at least 12% of all registered voters, and every legislative district needs at least 3% of its voters to sign on.
That's a lot of signatures. Sounds like changing the Constitution is a serious business.
It is. It's the foundation of their legal system. Any changes should reflect what the people want.
Okay, let's say an amendment is proposed no matter how. What happens next?
Any proposed amendment goes to the people for a vote. It's called a national plebiscite.
So ultimately, it's the people who decide.
You got it. It's their constitution, after all. And for it to pass, a majority of the people who vote in the plebiscite have to say yes.
This whole process is set up to ensure that any changes to the Constitution are carefully considered, have broad support, and truly reflect what the Filipino people want.
Exactly. The framers of the 1987 Constitution understood that it's important to make amending it difficult. That keeps it stable and lasting.
But they also knew it needed to be flexible enough to adapt to changes in the future.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
We've learned so much about this already, but I feel like there's even more to discover.
There always is. That's what makes studying constitutions so interesting. They show how complex societies are and how we're always trying to balance the past, the present, and the future.
I'm ready for more. What else makes the Philippine Constitution unique?
It's interesting, right? It gets into all these specific legal details, but then it also talks about these broader goals for the nation. Like, it really emphasizes social justice, human rights, education. Those are the pillars of Filipino society.
So it's not just about setting up the rules. It's about building a society that's just fair and gives everyone a chance.
That's it. It sets the bar high for the government. It's like it's pushing them to really live up to these values and make a better future for everyone.
It sounds really progressive, especially for something written back in 1987.
It is. And one of the places you see that forward thinking is in how it talks about education, science, technology, the arts, culture, even sports.
Wow, they covered a lot. What does it say about all of that?
Well, education is fundamental, right? It says that elementary education should be free and compulsory for every child, and that they should encourage high-quality education at every level.
So it's not just a right, it's almost like an obligation to get an education.
You could look at it that way. It's saying that an educated citizenry is essential for a healthy democracy.
Makes sense. Okay, so education is key. Where do science, technology, arts, culture, and sports come in?
Well, it encourages developing science and technology. Those are seen as crucial for moving the country forward. And it also puts a lot of emphasis on preserving and promoting Filipino arts and culture.
That's awesome, recognizing that a nation's culture and artistic expressions are part of what makes it special.
Exactly. And it even promotes physical education and sports because they want people to be healthy and active.
It's like they were trying to create a well-rounded society, one that's intellectually stimulated, culturally rich, and physically strong.
That's a great way to put it, a very holistic vision.
I'm honestly blown away by how much thought they put into this Constitution. It's so much more than a legal document. It's like a blueprint for how they want the nation to grow and flourish.
It truly is. And what I find particularly fascinating is how it weaves in Filipino values and aspirations, but also draws inspiration from global ideas about democracy and good governance.
It's like a blend of what's unique to the Philippines and what works well around the world.
You nailed it. The 1987 Constitution really captures the Philippine story as a nation, the struggles, the successes, and the hope for a better future.
This has been an amazing deep dive. I feel like I finally understand the Philippine Constitution and what it stands for.
That's fantastic to hear.
Yeah.
It's a document that deserves to be recognized for how strongly it supports justice, equality, and the well-being of all Filipinos.
Well said. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you've gained a new appreciation for the Philippine Constitution and the role it plays in shaping the nation's future.
If we step back and look at the big picture, the Philippine Constitution can teach other countries a lot. It shows how a nation can translate its values, hopes, and commitment to a fair and democratic society into a document that guides their path forward.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, listeners, there's always more to explore. If you've got a topic you'd like us to deep dive into, send it our way. We're always ready for another learning adventure.
Until next time, keep those minds working, keep asking those questions, and keep diving deep into the things that make you curious.
And most importantly, keep those interesting topics coming our way. We'll be right here, ready to dive in with you.